Crawl for it yourself, you crippled old man, my son-in-law said when I asked for a glass of water. My daughter sat just a few steps away and said nothing. I only smiled and tried to stand as if nothing had happened. But in that very moment, everything changed. That night, I made one phone call, and within hours, everything he thought he controlled began to fall apart. My name is Leonard Fisher. I'm 58 years old, and for 35 years I made my living as a maritime safety inspector for the Port of Charleston. I know what fraud looks like when it's dressed up in paperwork and sympathy. What I didn't know was that it had been living in my own house for 26 months. I broke my leg 45 days ago, and this morning I asked my son-in-law Trevor for a glass of water. What he said next would cost him everything he thought he was going to steal. Let me back up. Fisher Estate sits on 2 acres of James Island, about 20 minutes from downtown Charleston. My grandfather built the main house in 1952, and my father added the guest cottage and the private dock in the 70s. The property appraised at $1.5 million last year. Live oaks line the driveway, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that sways in the coastal breeze. The main house faces east to catch the morning light over the harbor, with a wraparound porch that my wife used to love for her morning coffee. It's the kind of house that makes certain people start calculating. Trevor Morgan moved in with my daughter Patricia 26 months ago. He's 41 years old, built like a man who had once been athletic and now maintained the memory of it through expensive gym memberships he rarely used. His company, Morgan Maritime Group, handles logistics for shipping clients up and down the eastern seaboard. At least, that's what he tells people at dinner parties when they ask about the sleek business cards he carries in his leather wallet. Patricia is 38 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and what used to be her mother's stubborn independence. Before 3 years with Trevor had taught her to move through rooms like someone who had memorized where all the sharp edges were. She works in medical equipment sales, traveling 3 days a week to hospitals across the Carolinas, which meant Trevor and I spent plenty of time alone in the house. Too much time, as it turned out. The morning I broke my leg, I walked out the front door to get the paper. The January air was cool and damp the way Charleston gets in winter, when the humidity hangs low over the marsh grass and everything feels slightly soggy. I stepped onto the porch and my foot went out from under me before I could register what was happening. Let me tell you something about oil on wooden steps. It doesn't pool in a perfect oval. It doesn't stay contained. It spreads, finds the grain, follows the path of least resistance unless someone placed it there. The patch I saw in the half second before I fell was too clean, too deliberate. The kind of detail that would have flagged an insurance claim in my old office. My leg hit the concrete walkway at the wrong angle. I heard the crack before I felt it. The sound echoed off the brick columns that support the porch roof, mixing with the cry of seagulls overhead. Then I felt it. Pain shot through my femur like lightning, white-hot and overwhelming. Patricia came running from the kitchen, her coffee mug still in her hand. "Dad, are you okay?" She knelt beside me on the cold concrete, her hands hovering over my leg like she was afraid to touch it. Steam from her coffee mixed with my breath in the cool air. Trevor appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the foyer. "I'll call the ambulance," he said, but his eyes weren't on my leg. They were scanning the entryway behind me, noting the craftsmanship of the crown molding, the value of the antique chandelier my grandmother had brought from Savannah in 1955. He wasn't looking at a father-in-law in pain. He was surveying a portfolio he intended to liquidate. I noticed. I filed it away. The cast came off last week, but I've been using the walking boot longer than necessary. Call it professional paranoia, but 35 years of investigating maritime insurance fraud teaches you to watch people when they think you're not watching. You learn to notice the small tells, the momentary expressions that reveal what someone really thinks when they believe no one is paying attention. This morning, the afternoon light came through the living room windows at Fisher Estate, casting long rectangles across the hardwood floor that my father had installed himself in 1978. I lay on the leather couch my wife had picked out 15 years ago, with my left leg elevated on 2 pillows. The walking boot was heavy and itching in ways I couldn't reach, the Velcro straps leaving red marks on my skin. The television blared a pre-game show at a volume that treated the walls as suggestions rather than boundaries. Trevor sat in the wingback, armchair near the window, the same armchair he had claimed 6 months after moving in, the one with the best view of the 65-inch television I'd bought last Christmas, and the worst view of anyone who might need something from him. The chair had been my reading spot for 20 years. Now it was Trevor's territory, marked with the impression of his body and the faint smell of his expensive cologne that lingered in the upholstery. He'd moved in gradually, one boundary at a time, until I found myself sleeping in my own bedroom, like a guest in my own house. My throat was dry. The kitchen was 15 feet away through the open archway, close enough that I could see the granite countertops my wife had insisted on during our last renovation. My crutches leaned against the arm of the couch within reach, but they promised pain with every step. "Trevor," I said, "could you get me a glass of water?" He did not look away from the screen. The commentators argued about point spreads with the intensity of men who had never played the game themselves. I waited 10 seconds, 20, watching his profile in the window light. His jaw was set in that particular way that suggested he'd heard me, but was choosing not to acknowledge it. Trevor. He turned then, and I saw something in his face I had been pretending not to notice for 2 years. Not irritation, not inconvenience. Dismissal. The look a man gives something he has already decided does not matter. His eyes were cold, calculating. The look of someone doing mathematics in his head and coming up with numbers he liked. "Crawl for it yourself," he said. His voice was low and certain, barely above a whisper but carrying across the room like a slap. "I'm not your servant, you crippled old man. Have you ever watched someone decide you don't matter anymore? Not guess it, not suspect it, but watch the exact moment they stop pretending? I watched it happen in my own living room, in the house my grandfather built with his own hands. From a man who had lived under my roof for 26 months and contributed nothing but opinions about how I should manage my property. The television kept blaring. Trevor turned back to his pregame show as if the conversation had never happened. The matter was settled as far as he was concerned. He picked up his beer from the side table, took a long drink, and settled deeper into my chair. Patricia was at the kitchen table with her laptop open, supposedly working on a proposal for the hospital in Colombia. She sat 12 feet away, close enough to hear every word through the open archway that connected the living room to the kitchen. My daughter heard every syllable of what her husband had just said to her father. I know she had, because she looked up when Trevor spoke. Her eyes met mine across the rooms, and I saw something flicker there, something that might have been shame or might have been calculation. She glanced at Trevor, then back at her laptop screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if she were about to type something important. Then she looked back at her phone instead. Let me be clear about something. My daughter heard every word. 12 feet away with no walls between us and no television volume loud enough to cover Trevor's voice. She looked up. She met my eyes. And then she looked back at her screen and pretended nothing had happened. That silence told me everything I needed to know about who she had chosen and what I had become in my own home. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not point out that I had paid for every wall, every window, every inch of the floor beneath his feet. I did not mention that he and Patricia had moved in temporarily after his business hit a rough patch and temporary had somehow stretched into years. Instead, I smiled. That's the part that matters. Not the pain in my leg, not the humiliation, not even Patricia's silence. The smile. Because in that moment, something shifted inside me. The performance I had been giving for months. The accommodating father, the grateful host, the man too old and too injured to notice what was happening in his own house. That performance ended. I reached for my crutches. The aluminum felt cold under my palms, familiar now after 45 days of depending on them. The movement sent fire through my leg, but I had dealt with worse pain in my career. Loading dock accidents, crane mishaps, the time I spent 3 days in a hospital bed after a cargo container nearly crushed me during an inspection in Savannah. I positioned the crutches under my arms and lifted myself from the couch. Each step was deliberate. Each step hurt. The hardwood floor creaked under my weight as I made my way across the living room, past Trevor's chair, through the archway into the kitchen. Trevor did not offer to help. Patricia did not look up from her laptop. The kitchen had been my wife's domain for 30 years. She'd designed every cabinet, chosen every tile, insisted on the deep farmhouse sink that now reflected. The afternoon light streaming through the windows over the breakfast nook. The granite countertops were cool under my free hand as I steadied myself, reaching for a glass from the cabinet she'd organized with military precision. I filled the glass from the tap, the water running cold over my fingers. Charleston tap water, has a mineral taste that reminds you you're drinking from an aquifer that's been filtered through centuries of sand and shell. I stood there drinking slowly, watching Trevor's reflection in the window glass above the sink. He looked comfortable, settled, completely at ease in a house that was not his, watching a television I had paid for, sitting in a chair he had claimed without asking. His feet were propped up on the ottoman my wife had reupholstered the year before she died, his beer leaving a ring on the antique side table that had belonged to my grandmother. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He knew I was 58. He knew I was recently widowed and had a broken leg and a daughter who had stopped defending me. What he did not know was what I had spent 35 years doing for a living. He did not know about the training, the cases, the hundreds of frauds I had dissected and exposed for the Port Authority. He did not know that I had spent my entire career studying men exactly like him. Men who smiled while they calculated, who offered help while they positioned themselves to take. Men who found vulnerable targets and applied steady pressure until those targets stopped pushing back. He was about to find out. I finished my water slowly, savoring each sip, while I watched Trevor in the window reflection. He was laughing at something on the television now, completely relaxed, probably thinking about dinner plans or weekend golf or whatever it is that men like Trevor think about when they believe they're winning. I set the glass in the sink where my wife used to wash our dishes together every evening, back when this kitchen was filled with conversation and laughter, instead of the sound of my crutches on tile and the distant blare of Trevor's sports programming. The afternoon light was fading now, the rectangles on the living room floor growing long and thin. Soon Patricia would start dinner, moving around Trevor like he was a piece of furniture she'd learned to navigate around. Soon the three of us would sit at the dining table my father had built, and Trevor would hold forth about his day, his business, his opinions about everything from politics to property values. But as I passed behind Trevor's chair on my way back to the couch, close enough to smell his cologne mixed with beer, I leaned down and whispered, "You just made the most expensive mistake of your life, son." He did not hear me. The television was too loud, and he was too comfortable in his certainty. But that was fine. He would understand soon enough. They both would. I made my way back to the couch that afternoon, lowered myself onto the leather, cushions that still held the impression of my body, and let the performance continue. Trevor never turned around. He had no reason to. In his mind, the matter of the water was settled, the hierarchy established. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Sleep does not come to people who have just discovered they are under siege in their own home. I lay on top of the covers until 1 a.m, organizing facts the way I used to before a major audit. Every observation, every red flag I had talked myself into ignoring over the past 26 months. Trevor's casual questions about property taxes, maintenance costs, what would happen to the estate if something happened to me, how elderly people sometimes made decisions they later regretted. I had told myself he was just being helpful. Now I understood he had been conducting reconnaissance. At 1:01, I reached for my crutches and made my way to the study. The room was at the back of the house, windows on 3 sides looking out over the salt, marsh. My desk faced the largest window, an old oak piece my grandfather had used for his construction business. File cabinets lined one wall, filled with 35 years of the case documents and fraud investigations. I closed the door behind me and turned on my laptop. The screen glowed blue in the darkness. I typed in the address for the South Carolina Secretary of State Business Registry. The page loaded halfway and then froze. I tried the Charleston County Property Records database. Error message. Trevor had quietly limited access on my home network, just enough to make certain sites unreliable, just enough to keep me from asking the wrong questions about his business operations. He had done this in my house, using equipment I paid for, without saying a word. Let me explain something about network restrictions to those who don't spend their careers in fraud investigation. They are locks, and locks only work on people who don't know how to pick them. Trevor had installed a deadbolt on my digital front door. He didn't know I had spent 3 decades walking through walls. I opened a command prompt and began typing. The techniques weren't complicated for anyone who had tracked fraudsters through corporate firewalls. Within 10 minutes, I had bypassed his restrictions entirely. The Secretary of State portal loaded without hesitation. I typed in Morgan Maritime Group LLC and pressed enter. Morgan Maritime Group had been incorporated in South Carolina 7 years ago. Trevor Morgan listed as sole owner and registered agent. Business purpose: logistics and freight coordination for maritime shipping. The company had filed annual reports every year, all showing healthy activity. Contract revenue for the past 2 years totaled $4.5 million. Declared profit: 0. Not losses: 0. I stared at the numbers on the screen. In 35 years of examining fraudulent claims, I had learned that numbers tell stories. A company pulling in $4.5 million in revenue does not report 0 profit by accident. That gap comes from money going somewhere it's not being reported. Either Trevor was hiding income from the IRS, or he was bleeding money faster than he could earn it. Either way, the picture of the successful businessman who just needed temporary help was a lie. I kept digging. Corporate filings, registered addresses, officer information. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. The registered agent address for Morgan Maritime Group LLC was 847 Harbor View Road, James Island, South Carolina. Fisher Estate, my home, my address. Listed as the official business address for Trevor's company, without my knowledge, without my consent. Do you know what happens when someone registers a business at your address without your permission? Every lawsuit, every collection notice, every threatening letter from the IRS comes to your mailbox. And if someone else gets there first, those letters disappear. The debts pile up, and the actual homeowner has no idea their property is being used as a shield for someone else's financial collapse. I pushed back from the desk and limped to the closet where I kept old files and recycling. Patricia had been emptying the guest room trash here every week, claiming she was helping keep the house tidy. I had not thought anything of it at the time. Now I dug through the bin with methodical precision. The first envelope I found was marked "Final Notice" in red letters. Debt collection agency pursuing unpaid vendor invoices. Amount owed, $47,000. The second was from a law firm in Atlanta. Breach of contract lawsuit filed by a shipping client who claimed Trevor had taken payment for cargo transport that was never completed. Damages sought, $115,000. The third was from the Internal Revenue Service. Notice of underpayment for unreported income, along with penalties and interest. Amount in question, $230,000. I kept sorting, letter after letter, creditor after creditor. The stack grew until it covered half my desk. Insurance. Claims denials, equipment lease defaults, unpaid port fees, contractor liens. When I added up all the demands for payment, the total came to $890,000. That's not a slow stretch. That's not a rough patch in the logistics business. That's a man drowning, grabbing for anything that floats. And he had decided my house was his life raft. A few days after the midnight investigation, it wasn't the numbers keeping me awake anymore. It was my own body. Something was wrong. My thoughts moved like they were wading through honey. Words I had known for 60 years would vanish mid-sentence. And every morning, Trevor handed me my supplements with that concerned smile. I reached for the word breakfast and found nothing. I walked into my study to get a book and stood there for 30 seconds, unable to remember why I had come. That's not aging. That's not stress. That's chemistry doing something to your brain that your brain didn't agree to. I forced myself to think backwards. When had this started? 3 months ago. October. Right around the time Trevor started giving me supplements. For bone healing, he had said, holding out the bottle with that helpful smile. 2 pills every morning, 2 more every evening. I had taken them obediently, grateful for my son-in-law's concern. I had been a fool. I had seen this play before at the Port Authority. Elderly employee starts declining. Supervisor expresses concern. Medical evaluations get scheduled. Early retirement gets suggested. By the time anyone realizes what happened, the experienced inspector is gone. That evening, I went to the bathroom before dinner and locked the door. Trevor had already laid out my supplements on the kitchen counter. I picked them up as I walked past, thanking him, and carried them with me. In the bathroom, I examined them under the light. Small, white, no markings. I did not swallow the pills. I wrapped them in a tissue and placed them in my pocket. That night, I addressed an envelope to an independent toxicology laboratory in Colombia. I had used them before on insurance cases. I placed the pills inside with a note requesting full chemical analysis. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. I waited until Trevor left and Patricia was upstairs. I went to my study, closed the door, and opened the envelope. The report was 3 pages of clinical language. I read until I reached the findings. Analysis indicates presence of benzodiazepine compounds at concentrations consistent with pharmaceutical profiles used to induce symptoms mimicking early onset dementia. Benzodiazepines. Sedatives calibrated not to knock me unconscious, but to slow my thoughts, blur my memory, make me fumble for words. Trevor had not been helping me heal. He had been erasing me 1 pill at a time. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Drug me into apparent dementia, arrange for medical evaluation, obtain guardianship through the courts, take control of the house, the accounts, the legacy. By the time anyone realized what had happened, I would be in a memory care facility, and Fisher Estate would belong to someone else. I would continue the performance, but now I would be directing it. The next morning, I told Patricia I had a doctor's appointment. What I had was a meeting at 188 Meeting Street with estate attorney Margaret Wilson. Her office was clean lines and natural light, stacks of files suggesting she had more clients than wall space. "Mr. Fisher, please sit down. Tell me what brings you in today." I opened my folder and began laying documents across her desk. The Morgan Maritime business filing showing $4.5 million in revenue and 0 profit. The collection notices totaling $890,000. The registered agent documentation proving Trevor had used my address for his failing company. And finally, the toxicology report. Margaret read each document without expression. When she reached the lab results, she read them twice. "Mr. Fisher, what you're describing is financial fraud, mail fraud, and assault. Have you considered going to the police? I've spent 35 years investigating fraud. Premature action destroys cases. Right now, my son-in-law believes his plan is working. I need him to keep believing that until I have built a case so complete that no attorney in South Carolina will be able to help him. What do you want from me? Protection for the house. Something that makes it impossible for him to take even if he gets guardianship. A revocable living trust. You transfer the property into the trust, name yourself as trustee and sole beneficiary. You retain complete control, but the title is held by the trust entity. Any attempt to alter that arrangement without your explicit consent runs into South Carolina trust law. I wrote her a check for $3,200. The paperwork would be ready within the week. That evening, Trevor waited until we were all seated at the dining table before he produced the documents. The mahogany table my father had built could seat 8 people, but tonight it felt crowded with just the 3 of us. Between the salt shaker and the breadbasket sat a stack of papers that would have signed away my life if I hadn't been expecting them. "Leonard," Trevor said, setting down his fork, "we need to discuss your situation. I've prepared some documents that will help protect everyone." "What kind of documents?" "Power of attorney. It's just a precaution. You've been forgetful lately. We've all noticed." Patricia sat very still across the table. She had not taken a bite since Trevor started speaking. "And if I don't want to sign?" That was when Trevor's mask slipped. His expression shifted from concerned son-in-law to something harder. "Then we'll have to discuss other options. There are facilities that specialize in cases like yours. Patricia and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to consider your long-term care needs." Patricia's face had gone pale. She was watching her husband like she was seeing him for the first time. "Are you threatening me, Trevor? I'm trying to help you, Leonard. Whether you see it that way is up to you." He pushed the papers closer to me. "But we need to resolve the situation with this house. I want you to understand what it took not to react. 35 years of professional discipline. The knowledge that the recording device in my pocket was capturing every threat. The certainty that the documents he was waiving would never be signed because the house already belonged to a trust he didn't know existed. I appreciate your concern," I said. "Let me think about it. Think about it quickly. I've already made some calls. The facility I found has an opening next week." Dinner ended shortly after that. Trevor retreated to the guest cottage. Patricia cleared the dishes without meeting my eyes. I went to my study and closed the door. I dialed a number I hadn't used in 12 years. Nathan Pierce answered on the 3rd ring. He was 36 now, a special agent with the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. Mr. Fisher, his voice carried surprise and respect. It's been a long time. Nathan, I need 10 minutes, not as a favor, as a professional consultation. I laid out the evidence, the $4.5 million in revenue at Morgan Maritime with zero declared profit, the $890,000 in hidden debts, the mail fraud using my address. Nathan listened without interrupting. Send me what you have, he said finally. What you're describing falls within a range that would typically warrant a preliminary review. Several days later, Nathan called back. What I sent had crossed the threshold for formal review. Morgan Maritime was now officially a federal matter. The first light came around 5:30. I heard the vehicles before I saw them. 3 dark SUVs coming down Harborview Road, turning into the driveway without sirens, but with purpose. Trevor came out of the guest cottage in a bathrobe, unshaven, squinting at the agents like they were a dream he couldn't wake from. Trevor Morgan, federal agents. We have a warrant. To search the premises. There must be some mistake, Trevor's voice carried across the yard. I need to call my attorney. You can call your attorney from the field office. Step aside, sir. I watched them search the cottage. I watched them load boxes of documents into the SUVs. Trevor stood in the driveway, watched by an agent who had no interest in conversation. His face cycled through confusion, denial, and finally understanding. He looked toward the main house. He saw me sitting on the porch with my coffee. For a long moment, our eyes met. I raised my cup in a small salute. 3 days later, Trevor sat across a metal table in the Charleston County Detention Center. Margaret Wilson laid the settlement documents between them. 3 pages, total waiver of all claims to Fisher Estate. Sign here, here, and here. This waives all claims, past, present, and future, to the Fisher Estate property. His hand trembled as he picked up the pen. The signature he wrote was small and cramped. That afternoon, I sat in the kitchen at Fisher Estate with Patricia, the same kitchen where she had stayed silent while Trevor told me to get my own water. Now, it was just the 2 of us, and the only thing between us was honesty. I should have seen it, Dad. Patricia's voice was quiet but steady. The way he talked about the house, the way he looked at you. He was good at what he did, sweetheart. That's why they're dangerous. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her grip was firm, the way her mother's used to be. I'm not going anywhere, Dad, and neither is this house. I squeezed her hand back. We sat like that for a while, the morning light coming through the windows, the silence comfortable for the first time in years. The house settled around us, the familiar creaks and groans of a structure that had sheltered my family for 7 decades. My leg had healed, my mind had never been clouded, and the man who had tried to take everything from me had signed away his last claim to any of it. For the first time in months, I slept without dreaming of schemes or supplements or signatures. Fisher Estate was secure, and so was I. Remember when Trevor told me to crawl for my own water? That man just signed away every right to the house he tried to steal. Patience, it turns out, is a weapon, and sometimes the best revenge is simply letting the law do its job. Never mistake an old man's patience for weakness. Sometimes we're just gathering evidence while you dig your own grave. The best defense against family predators isn't anger or confrontation. It's using the very skills that made you successful to protect what you've built.